a segment that the third adopted writer brother came up with as an idea, and I'm glad we finally decided to make time for this. Starship Troopers! Carry on, you've been really great with the introductions. I'm just going to let you have this one again.
All right, so Starship Troopers, the book versus the movie. So let's start with a little bit of the movie, because I'm sure everybody's a lot more familiar with the movie than they are with the book. The movie was done by Paul Verhoeven. He took a script that he had been working on for a completely different story that was based more on pointing out the problems with fascism, and was handed the job of adapting Starship Troopers to the big screen finally. For anyone who follows the works of Robert Heinlein, you'll know that when he passed, the rights holder became his wife, and his wife was very reluctant after The Puppet Masters was made into a movie to release any other books to be made into shows. But she finally relented and allowed Starship Troopers to get made. And what Paul did was he took his own take on from this previous script, adapted it to feel like Starship Troopers, and this is what we got. The general rundown is it follows the main character, Rico, as he's going through his life as a citizen in the Federation. It starts with him doing his placement test, realizing that he wasn't going to get too far in regular scholastic life, but seeks adventure and joins the military. He faces the brutalities of the modern mobile infantry, loses his girlfriend to a career in the military, and during all this, the beginnings of an alien invasion starts. And we wind up seeing the character progress from a young private all the way up to a commander running his own unit. So it's interesting. It takes a very decidedly sarcastic look at the fascist world that kind of cropped up in Starship Troopers, and doesn't go very deep into any of the lore of the world building. It focuses more on Rico's story of, boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl, girl falls in love with military, boy falls into military, aliens invade, it's time to save the universe, boy finds girl in cave, trying to take back the galaxy. The book is a totally different matter, though. The book opens with our main character having already been in the military for quite some time, and operating on a raid using techniques and whatnot that, believe it or not, West Point Academy has pointed to as potential future operations that they would love to see the technology for, and a future way of doing war. We then cut back to his initial starting time, his initial training time. Gone are the vaguely psychic phenomenon discussions. This is focused more in less hand-wavy sci-fi, I would say, and focuses more on military life and the concept of what would happen if, after a major galactic or a major planetary catastrophe, if the veterans of those wars came together and said, the civilians who are pushing us around on a map no longer have the moral authority to run the world, so we're going to step in. And that's exactly what they do. They decide that in order for you to have the moral authority to be able to make decisions for everyone, you must first choose to put your life on the line for those people. To that end, they make sure anybody who is capable of functioning in society has an opportunity to serve in some fashion. Our main character starts out as a private in the infantry and slowly moves up through his deeds and actions, and not only learns how to be a good soldier, but learns how to be a good officer and how to command others and how to get along in that structure. We don't focus so much on his relationship to his former girlfriend. We are focused much more on the military life and the concepts of the escalation ladder, if you will, that the concept of force being used as a teaching tool, not necessarily as a bullying method. So the book touches on a lot deeper philosophy in terms of why you would fight and how you would fight and why societies are organized the way they are. I personally find the book a fascinating discussion about coming from a generation, because when Heinlein wrote the book, he had just gotten back from World War II. So having, his understanding of how necessary military conflict is in some situations and trying to translate that to a philosophy that everyone could understand and in fact get behind, I think is a fascinating read, and I think it's worth checking out. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I am very glad that I watched the show, or watched the movie, before reading the book in this case. Because I still have a favorable opinion of the movie, but not without calling out the cultural vandalism that it is. It deviates so heavy from the book that I was like, this is exactly what modern pop culture is doing right now with current works. Like, we see this with Star Trek, Star Wars, Doctor Who, literally everything is deviating so hard from source material that I would have, oh man, if I was the writer, if I signed off Galaxia onto a project like this, and this is what they just decided to steal my characters and scenes and then throw in their own concept, I would be livid, which is why I will never give up such creative control. The movie is still good. This is not the movie bad, book better, usual thing. The movie by itself, with its own story and its own implications, is still enjoyable. It's kind of interesting how when the movie came out, less than 5 years later, we're in the Iraq War now, and it's like you watch Starship Troopers after Iraq, Afghanistan, and you're like, huh, okay. So it kind of has its own sort of retroactive commentary in that regard when the original author wrote that movie and transcribed the book. So Starship Troopers as a movie, I still recommend watching. It's not without its problems though. It basically took characters, and it even went so far as to take actual scenes from the book, because I'm listening to the audiobook and I'm like, this is right out of the movie. Oh wait, other way around. So you took the scenes of the characters, but then you just, I'm going to go do my own thing. This is a good example of what not to do when putting a book on screen. It's okay to take your own... It would actually be okay if they called it Starship Troopers and just renamed the characters. I think that would have gone over so much better for the book folks who would be like, well, the book follows this other character, which I hear there's an animated series out there worth checking out. I'll have to look into it before I say anything one way or the other. It's a good example of, like, it wouldn't even be so bad if they used the same characters. I think what really just struck me at my core was actual word-for-word scenes taken from the book. Why? Why would you put that? It's like what you say, Carry On, when it comes to Halo. Why are they going so into the detail of the series, but they're just going in a totally different direction? What's the point? At that point, just make your own show. Because now you're just going to piss off fans that are already dedicated to a product. Thankfully, that's not the case. I can still look at the movie because by itself, the movie's story is still good. It has its own story in its own universe. So, as far as what I thought the book was, I thought the book was great. It was a great use of my time to sit down and just kind of listen, because it does focus more on the concept of the universe, not really so much the other implications that the movie brings up. And so, yeah, I highly recommend that you watch both, that you watch the show and you listen to the book or read the book, and just kind of, you got to make your own opinion out of it on the end of the day. Because as I said, the movie's still good. I'll still tell people, yeah, watch the movie. But just understand that the cultural vandalism has been going on for many years. This is nothing new for Hollywood, unfortunately. And it's sad to... It was really... I was just like... It's never changed. It's always the same. But overall, both are great in their own right. Just... Oh man, also
Very different.
what a bad transcription from book to screen. That's my thoughts on it. To start, John, you've been sitting there patiently waiting.
Yeah, I didn't really feel like. I didn't think the movie was terrible, aside from the fact that it really it put on all the normal archetypes, like you said, Carry On. It brought in the boy meets girl, girl joins military, boy follows her, boy gets really into the military, meets another girl, meets the other girl, and it felt like its own story, but the book felt like the first bug fight in the movie and everything before that. Like,
Yeah.
aside, like, I feel like the book took this just tons of time to explain, like, a legit future military. I legitimately felt that the writer's understanding of why people fight in the first place was more organic than any movie I've ever seen since. And more than anything, it was more organic than what I learned in the military. Going into the military was a lot like going into the beginning of this movie, where these people are like, especially the scene where it's like, I'm doing my part, and there's the kid. He says, I'm doing my part, and everybody laughs at him. Like, that's what the military really is. Like, when I joined, there was a swath of people that legitimately said the commercials motivated them to become Marines. And every commercial that they mentioned, I didn't know. Like, for me, my personal justification for joining the military was to prove I could do it to myself. But when I read this book, I felt like that's a lot more what I was getting from it, because the military, especially from what I've learned from people that live in places like the UK or more internal European countries, as we've gotten from World War II, most of their entire societies are actually fighting the idea that you owe your nation anything. Like we watch a lot in media these days about, like, what do you want from your country, right? Do you want healthcare? Do you want Medicaid? Do you want Social Security? Do you want retirement? Do you want land? Do you want police? All those things. But very rarely do we have the JFK question of, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And especially nowadays, where the governments are becoming more and more organized by the wealthy elite, and they're mostly benefiting the wealthy elite. The poorest of us, the ones that actually end up being forced to join the military in times of crisis, we see no reason to give our nations, wherever they may be, anything. Like, why would I ask my country what I can do for it when it's literally only benefiting the rich and the top? And the way this book talked about it was like exactly where we're headed. The way the elites are defining civilian versus citizen is, a civilian is somebody who reaps the fruit of the nation but does nothing to help it. And that thought, especially drawn out, especially after an alien invasion, especially after global catastrophes, especially after like the mechanization of the military, it makes it almost impossible to convince the people that are spending most of their days from high school, or from middle school all the way up to high school, childhood all the way through to high school, and then once they graduate, their next option is, do I go to college? Well, if I can't afford it, then no, so I'm gonna go be something in this world or this nation. And I'm kind of rabbit trailing away from the story, but the way that the the book painted the birth of the fascism. It wasn't this idea of, well, we're the number oneest nation, we're the coolest, we have won the most wars, we have the toughest and biggest military. Instead, it was like, no, we're the toughest because we demand service for certain rights. Like, you have to sacrifice in order to get something. And then that sacrifice, like, anybody who does sacrifice feels like anybody who hasn't sacrificed isn't worthy. And that compounded over years and years and years leads to what we see in this, like, military. And it just, honestly, this is a military I would actually enlist in versus the one I did enlist in. Because even the sergeants and the officers throughout the story, their entire mission is about bringing their people home, but they can't let their people think that it's all about them getting home. And that's why there's all these lines in the book where it talks about, look, I don't care if you die, as long as your suit gets back to us, that's all we care about. But then you meet the officers and you hear the stories of the officers, and it's like, yeah, Officer so-and-so was the last person on the lifeboat every single time. He did not let a single troop get on after him. He had everybody on before he ever got on. And that's the military every military person wants to fight in, is they want officers and sergeants that are hard when they're trying to make you hard. But when it actually, like, push comes to shove, they'll shove the enemy back until you're on the lifeboat flying home, even if they're not. And I feel like that's where the movie really missed out. Is like, this book painted a very plausible and potential fascist government that had actual citizens motivated to be a part of it and backing it up and supporting it. And even the main character's father, he's like, no, you can't join the military, you can't do it. And throughout the book, this destroys his son. Like, his son just has no relationship with his dad, can't talk to him. His mom just keeps laying it on him about how much of a failure he is for joining. And then one day, Rico meets his dad, they're switching ships. And that showed him, it changed the whole story. Rico was doing what he thought was right, and by the end of the story, his dad says, you were right, I should have done this. I should have been the example for you, but you were the example for me. And that's so much more beautiful than some romance. Or, a mixed gendered bathroom. Those scenes, while making the movie more fun and, proving in the future that we can be better to each other, and especially when you add robot suits, then it becomes very meaningless which gender's in the robot, as long as both of them are trained in the right tactics. And that's kind of what the movie gave us, but the book gave us so much more human. It gave us human despite talking about aliens. They got rid of the Russia-China fight, the America-Russia-China fight, the unions, the Allies and Axis, and they changed it so that the Allies were borderline Nazis fighting a more extreme enemy, but at the same time it was 1,000% more human than even Saving Private Ryan. I felt more fulfilled and satisfied in reading this book than I did in the last 10 sci-fi movies I've watched. And that has just never happened when it comes to books.
Yeah. I to build on what you're saying, there's an interesting section in the book where while Rico's at officer school, they talk about why the world is a fascist state the way it is. And the answer was simply, well, because it works. If a different system came along and was better, we'd all 100% be sliding over to it. But because we just don't have a better system available to us, this is what we're using. And I think that spoke really, really well to why a nation would choose to go in this direction, where it's kind of like I almost want to call it like a democratic fascist environment, where people are voting, but they're only voting for a specific group of individuals who have served. I also really liked your analogy of reaping, like people that just reap from the fruit versus other people. I mean, literally what they're saying is the people who plant the fruit trees are the ones who get to vote on how the fruit is distributed. And that, that makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, when you break it down like that, of course, when you put it into far more reaching implications of that philosophy in terms of the government. Of course, things get, kind of dangerous and weird, but it does make a lot of sense as a starting point. And that's almost the danger of the book in a lot of ways, and the good part of the book too.
Yeah, I loved that about the book because, well, obviously the idea of this government being the best possible choice for the entire world is extremely convoluted and extremely naive in terms of like what, global communication actually does to a society, because the writer didn't ever experience instantaneous global communication like we have. But instead, he explained how America, they went into it. They said, what about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And he said, how can you have those rights if you can't breathe? And that, I'm pretty sure I paraphrased and butchered the line, but that question is real, because when you're, especially in terms of like this world and this universe, especially for the humans, is run mostly by the government. And in that aim, the government has made it so that extraterrestrial travel is 100% real. Like, they're setting up colony planets. They've solved overpopulation by exploration and conquest. But then that exploration and conquest has led to different fights and different wars and different separations that caused a need for an active, regularly supplied military. And that military service, and in a lot of cases, like we were just talking about in Slow Horses, there's a lot of jobs in the military that never ever see action. There are a lot of people needed for intelligence gathering. There are a lot of people needed for training, personnel training. Supply chain logistics is one of the most essential pieces of military, any kind of military success. And the book legitimately took the time to explain why A, Rico wasn't going to join any of those, but B, why those are important, and C, it took the time to elaborate on why the writer thought this world could exist. Like, the writer actually took the time to see the future, write the pathway to the future, and then also write it from a fascist perspective that promotes the fascist government. He didn't ignore anything. He intentionally guided, especially like you said when you brought up the OCS, Officer Candidate School training. It legitimately explains how the fascism played a major role. And it explains it from the government to the government employees. Like, it's not he didn't learn this in the mobile infantry. He didn't learn this in sergeant's training course. He learned this as he was becoming an officer who was about to be relied upon to go back and teach it to his sergeants, or at the very least enforce it. And that's what made this book so real, is even though it's about aliens, even though it's about science, it really felt almost no fiction. And that's wild.
Yeah,
great choice.
I think that's one of the. Yeah, I think one of the great things about it too, about the way they explain it and everything is not just that it's plausible, but you can see that this is a government that, you know, only veterans would come up with, because having spent as much time around veterans as I have, you know, they don't hide anything about how the government is operating. I mean, operational secrets are one thing, but how everything is put together, it's not like a traditional fascist state that's gonna, you know, try to protect its citizens from the truth. No, it flat out tells its citizens, here's what's going on, here's how we got here, here's why we got here. So it's not just equipping these soldiers with survival skills, but it's equipping them with the understanding of the life skills that they're going to need in order to lead others. And that, I think, was a textbook example of how I have always seen veterans behave to other veterans. You know, no lies, no secrecy, just straight up, here's why we do what we do. And here's how we're going to do it. And that, I mean, if there's one thing I think we can all agree on our government's existence right now, I think we'd all agree that that would be really nice to have a lot more of. Right? I think, you know, dropping civics as much as it has been kind of a detriment that, you know, at the very least, this book will convince you why civics is an important course to have.
I mean, transparency, I believe, is the answer to solving most of the corruption issues, and that's for all governments. But everyone's got to want to be on board with it. You know, we can't just think that just because we have the right idea that, all right, we'll just go ahead and force you all to accept the U.S. Constitution. No, because that, you know, that becomes imperialism. Everyone's got to be wanting to go for it. However, that said, I have talked to a lot of people from either different regions or grew up in different regions, and there's usually a consistency between them that, oh yeah, we need, you know, while some of our ideas may be opposite, while some of our ideas may conflict, ultimately most everyone ends up agreeing on the basic concept of, oh yeah, we need more transparency, we need better education, we need to be more truthful with everything we do, typically. I mean, not like literally every detail of your life, but it's like that's the extreme that needs to at least be held to our governments is, no, I want to know, and I don't want to get into like a super, I'm going to try and stay as apolitical as possible. I want to know what every cent of my taxpayer dollars goes to. And every single person who pays taxes should have that right to know where your money's going and to have more of a say in what your money's going towards. And that's just one example. It's all, you can apply the same thing to every single aspect. And, you know, yeah, the argument that you get pushback of is, well, national security. Well, if we're not hiding anything, it's not really that big of a deal, you know. Doesn't it? You kind of get rid of the problem in that process if we're not really super worried. Outside of personal defense, we don't really need to keep a whole lot of secrets in the long run. So and that's just one idea, though. And I'm not saying I have the right idea. I just that's just a consistency when I argue with people that we come off as political opposites. It's like we end up agreeing. Transparency doesn't matter what system you want to put on top of that. If there isn't enough transparency and accountability, which that's basically what the author showed us in this book, was because they're so straightforward with everything. Yeah, we know what we are. We're not going to hide it. Most people go along with it because they're not being BS'd or fed a bunch of lies. John, you had a thought.
Yeah, so I think you're onto a couple of things here, especially with what this society does differently than what most fascist governments does is there's a difference between a civilian and a citizen. A civilian is somebody who is born in the nation, raised in the nation, and has yet to contribute to the nation. The nation being, you know, the human race in this show or in this story. And so the civilian they aren't a slave to the nation. They aren't a serf. They aren't a peasant. They aren't poor. Like Rico's family is very wealthy, and in the book he's trying to go to Stanford, or that's what his dad wants for him. So it's not like being a civilian means you don't get the chance to make a bunch of money, or you don't get to live a fruitful life. Instead, it's that, like what you were saying about, I want to be able to know where my tax dollars go. like, yeah, I think that that's extremely important. But the reason why we don't is because we started relying on a federal government to take care of the taxes rather than the state governments. And if it was the state governments, then the counties and the cities could actually contribute. And then me as a person living within a city can regulate my city. And if you regulate your city, the two cities will compete economically but grow together because we're not actually fighting. And that's how you have cities growing exponentially, and then if the cities are all growing, then the state grows. If the state grows, then the federal government grows. But in the way we're doing it now is we're giving all of our money to the top. The top is then saying, we know how to spend it because you elected us to be in charge, so we're going to spend it. And yeah, exactly, like the
I'm going along with you, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, the impetus for of knowledge doesn't exist. Like, we don't actually care if our politicians are the smartest people in the union. We care that they're supposedly in line with our values, even though almost never do politicians actually state their values unless they want to lose their race. And that's what I feel like that's what the author was starting to see in post-World War II America, because that's what was happening from FDR to Lyndon Johnson to, I want to say it goes Nixon, JFK, I can't remember exactly the order.
Nixon was after JFK.
I couldn't remember if he had one run first, JFK showed up, and then JFK died and he came back after
He ran against him in the first election and lost.
That's what it was. He just ran against him. But so, like, the things that the author was seeing was that we're giving up our responsibility. Like, we are actively asking other people to take care of our cities for us, and we're asking people that live 2,000 miles away to, like, we're asking somebody who lives in Washington, D.C., who has to deal with Washington, D.C. traffic, politics, life, commerce, trade, meeting people, to deal with Boise stuff in the 50s, even though they couldn't even talk to Boise without a phone. And if they talked to them, they weren't going to get the full picture, because it's not like everybody in Boise was wholly educated enough to paint the picture, right? And that's what I mean by this.
It's almost like we need to kind of reorganize,
take control of our own
space, make them all digital.
Well, no, I think we need to be responsible for our land. If we're going to claim to be a citizen of an area, then we need to be keepers of that area. And I think that's really what this movie represented in the book, more so than the movie, is the book really goes into that. Those that put in the effort to sacrifice, to educate themselves, those are the ones that are going to run this nation because they put in more effort than everybody else. If you don't put in that effort, fine, but you don't get to get mad at the ones that are actually working for working. And that to me seemed more fair. Now, if it were to go start in this world, I feel like we'd very quickly go back to what the Nazis and what China's actively doing with the Uyghurs, like concentration camps, because the lazy civilian can't be trusted to do their job unless we threaten them with permanent imprisonment, which is what we do here in America as well. I mean,
we don't threaten anybody with prison. We pick them out when they're young and possibly volatile, and we ship them off to privately owned prisons. But anyway, no big deal.
I mean, this is the one thing. This is the wonderful thing about this book, though. It's actually take a look at what just happened here. The three of us were able to have a very deep, very interesting discussion about our own civics, right? And we're able to do it in such a way that we all had a respectful understanding of each other's positions. Even if we don't necessarily 100% agree with them, we are able to use this concept of a framework as an idea that we can all get behind, right? We all agree, hey, we need more transparency. We need more, we like these things about this society from the book, and it's making us look at what we have here and saying, maybe we need to look at those issues. And that's what great sci-fi work should do. It should make you think, and not necessarily spoon feed you the answers, but give you a starting point to start looking for your own answers, right? One of Heinlein's primary themes in his books has always been about personal responsibility. And this really comes into play in this book. And we're, I think, all in agreement that in general, we'd be in a much better place as a society and probably as a species if all of us took a lot more personal responsibility in our day-to-day activities.
I agree.
If that isn't an author managing to get across the importance of that through this work, I mean, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I've never read a book that encouraged so much personal responsibility while simultaneously showing how if everybody does their job, it looks a lot like communism. In the most general sense, right? Each person has a role to fill. And throughout the whole book, we hear very little about the need for money, how much they're getting paid, how much it matters to them in their day-to-day. They almost, like, the main character has 3 hots and a cot every night, every day. And that the role that he plays is so important to the greater good, but only if it also feels like it's important to the main character. And that's what they were like harping on in such an aggressive sense. It's like you said, personal responsibility, but also what are you responsible for? Like without civics class, we don't know what we can affect, and we don't know how to affect change. Like we can't, it's more we don't know what we don't know because no one ever explained it. And by the time somebody does explain it, it's usually a con artist who's on their way to taking over a nation because they figured out how to play the game. And that this book made government and the citizens' role in government so much less about playing the game correctly and so much more about the government's duty to explain the game to everyone, and then the players can play. And yeah, civics, I think, is the only way we know where we came from, where we're going, and how we're trying to get there, so that we can then jump in and do our part, which especially in the modern day, most of our parts is just be nice. Like most of our roles is, if we're not causing problems, people have less reason to have problems with us. And then when they do have problems with us, because we've been nice the whole time, they're wrong, and our force was necessary, and obviously necessary. But if we're always braggadocious and audacious, and always just assuming that our government has the entire world, let alone our best interests at heart, then that's where we get this blind leading the blind. Nobody knows where we're going because nobody has any idea of what good would look like. And this book, while it was about a fascist government, at least made it look like it could work. Star Wars obliterated the rebellion that took over right after we had the whole culmination of like, yes, now the people taking back the power, and no. Now nobody's taking power, just people are fighting for it. And I feel like this book made so much more realistic sense in a sci-fi universe.
Yep.